Joel, great to be with you here on Jerusalem Dateline.
Great to be with you, Chris. Yeah. Thank you so much.
We're just marking the one-year anniversary of the Abraham Accords. You have been involved in that behind the scenes, sometimes more visibly. Tell us, 1 year later, how would you evaluate the progress of the Abraham Accords?
Well, Chris, I was amazed at the doors that God has opened in recent years. I describe it in the new book, Enemies and Allies. I feel like I got a front row seat and a backstage pass because my evangelical delegations that I was leading into these countries, Egypt, Jordan, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, were all prior to the Abraham Accords. And yet, sitting in the palace in the United Arab Emirates, in Abu Dhabi, the capital, with the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Zayed, we were sitting on a bombshell headline, which was he told us that he was going to make peace with Israel, and that was 2 years before the Abraham Accords. The problem with that conversation at the time was it was off the record. He had wanted to have a candid conversation and be able to talk freely, and we were fine with that because we didn't know what he was going to say, but we kept his confidence. But now that it's happened, that MBZ became the first leader in the Arab world in a quarter of a century, a generation, to make peace with Israel, the beginnings of the Abraham Accords. Now that story I tell in Enemies and Allies, and I sort of take you into the room to how that conversation unfolded. Look, after a year, we now have 4 agreements, and we have other countries significantly warming towards Israel. And it's the best news coming out of a region which is usually all bad news. But CBN has been able to do a lot of reporting of some of the most exciting and encouraging developments when usually you're covering war and terror and trauma and darkness.
Very encouraging. You were there behind the scenes before it happened. You were there in the White House when they signed the original Abraham Accords. How would you say what's happened in 1 year? Could you expect it to progress so far right now? And how would you give it an evaluation or a grade 1 year later?
Well, I think the courage that it took to make those agreements, particularly with MBZ and King Hamad of Bahrain, and Netanyahu and Trump, look, this was A+. They all should have won Nobel Peace Prizes. It's really offensive and ridiculous that you can't win a Nobel Peace Prize for making peace, for the first time in a quarter century. But it just shows how devalued, unfortunately, the Nobel Peace Prize has become. But in terms of implementation, I would say, B-, but not because there hasn't been effort. I mean, in other words, B- is pretty good. But COVID slowed some things down, and the massive change from the Trump administration to the Biden administration slowed things down. And the Biden administration needing to figure out, are we really for the Abraham Accords or against them? Or just not going to deal with it? For the first 9 months of the year, we saw almost no movement from the Biden administration. And so they were getting a D-. They weren't even using the term Abraham Accords. It was like, well, that's Trump's term, that's Pence's term, that's Pompeo's term, we're not using it. They didn't say that, but that's the way it felt. Mm-hmm. But I would say in the last month and a half to 2 months, we've seen movement. We've seen the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, invite the Israeli and the Emirati foreign ministers to have a sit-down conversation. They did a press conference. They've done a number of Zoom events. I think there's now movement that the Biden administration has realized there's no reason for this not to be bipartisan. And I think that's a good thing. So let's say that the Biden administration moved from a D- to a C+. But there's a long way to go, and there's much more that needs to be done. The most encouraging factoid that coming out of the last year is that 250,000 Israelis flooded into the United Arab Emirates to see this new country that they were always forbidden to enter. And as Israel lowers its COVID barriers to foreigners entering the country, I think we're going to see a flood of Emiratis and Bahrainis and Moroccans and others coming into Israel, and I think that's going to be really exciting.
1 year on, one of the biggest questions people have right now, will Saudi Arabia join the Abraham Accords? What do you think?
Well, I deal with this question a lot in the new book, Enemies and Allies, which I would just note that it's the first book, it's the only book that takes you inside the fascinating and tectonic changes going on inside the Middle East today, including the first and only book that deals with the Abraham Accords, how they came about. There are others coming, but this is the first one out there and the only written by an evangelical. I deal with the Saudi question a lot because I did have this opportunity to lead 2 evangelical delegations to Saudi Arabia to meet with the highest leaders just short of King Salman himself. The short version is I believe the Saudis are weighing right now at the highest levels, is it in their national interests to make peace with Israel? They've watched their neighbors do it, and they have supported the neighbors. They could have thrown a monkey wrench into the whole process, but what have we seen the Saudis do? They've allowed Israeli civilian aircraft to fly over Saudi territory and Bahraini and Emirati flights to come here to Israel over the Saudi airspace. That had never happened before. The Saudis are making positive statements. They're allowing coverage in the Saudi media of the Abraham Accords development. That's encouraging. Maybe most interesting is that Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, whom I met with twice, invited then Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the head of Israel's spy agency, the Mossad, Yossi Cohen, and then U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to meet with him in person on Saudi soil in the northwest province of Saudi Arabia in December of last year. I talk about that in Enemies and Allies. That's a big deal. It is saying both publicly and privately the Saudis are moving towards normalization. But they're not there yet. And I think there's going to be a lot of reporting we still need to do. But when that happens, if it happens, I think it will. My prediction on CBN News is I think the Saudis are going to make that decision, that it is in their national interest. And then the question is, do they get any credit from the Biden administration for doing it? President Biden has put the Saudis in a doghouse, right? You're a pariah state. We're not dealing with you. I'm not talking to MBS. I'll only talk to your father. There's been a hostility there. But National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan was just in Riyadh, and apparently, according to the reporting, did raise the question, how can we help you get to yes with the Israelis? That's a very interesting development, and it's new, and we're going to have to watch to see if the Biden administration considers it in their interest to invest in that relationship. I hope they do. I'm very bipartisan, nonpartisan on the issue of Middle East peacemaking.
Yeah, there's a lot of celebration 1 year after the Abraham Accords, but as you say, also in your book, Enemies and Allies, the enemies. Where do you see the enemies coming against or posing this new tectonic change in the Middle East?
Well, in many ways, the enemies are helping drive the change, meaning the threat from the Iranian regime to build out a nuclear weapons program, to continue not only building but firing ballistic missiles at their enemies, including supplying missiles to the Houthi terrorists in Yemen, and the Houthis are firing those Iranian-built missiles into Saudi Arabia. This is what's causing the Arab world to fundamentally reassess their relationship with Israel, right? For 100 years, the Arab world said Zionism, the Jews, any prospect of a nation state of Israel was anathema, totally forbidden, absolutely not. We're against it in every possible way. But of late, as they see the Iranian threat rising, and they see Israel economically strong, technologically strong, confident, and militarily the regional superpower, all the Arab leaders are beginning to recalculate. Like, why are we against Israel? If we have to go to war to neutralize the Iran threat, can we count on the Biden administration to be with us? And if we can't, that means we're on our own. Who else might we ally ourselves with to get the job done? And they're looking to Israel. Again, I don't think that's the only reason. They want to be part of the technology and the economic growth and prosperity and progress that Israel is leading in. But it's clear that the Iran threat is focusing the minds of regional leaders who were against Israel and now are thinking, I don't think they're our enemy. I think they're our ally. And in the case of Mohammed bin Zayed, he gets the most credit because he took the lead and told us, I'm ready, I've made the decision, it is in the UAE national interest, and I'm just looking for a path forward. And then when he led in August of 2020, August 13th, made the announcement that he's making peace with Israel, what happened? Bahrain came in less than a month later, then Morocco and Sudan, and Kosovo, a Muslim but non-Arab country, also normalized relations with Israel. This is a big, big deal. And unfortunately, many Christians are not aware of how big this is and what's happening, that this is an answer to the prayers of millions and millions and millions of Christians, CBN viewers in particular, who've been praying for the peace of Jerusalem for a long time. And we are seeing the fruit of that for the first time in a generation.
One thing we've seen recently, Joel, is the Blue Flag 2021. 7 nations joined Israel. Now, what was unprecedented is, in addition to those 7 nations, was the Air Force commander of the UAE came to pay a visit to the commander of the Israeli Air Force. Do you see that while the diplomacy has been going on for a year, a possible more overt military cooperation between Israel and its Arab neighbors?
I think the military and intelligence cooperation has been happening long before the openness of the Abraham Accords. I think the Abraham Accords, in many ways, solidified and brought out into the open below the radar, relationships that were being tied together. The Bahrainis, for example, told me, a very senior Bahraini official told me, we don't even call this normalization in Bahrain. We call it formalization, meaning we were already moving in this direction. We just couldn't say it. But now, because of MBZ's courage and the King Hamad's courage, now we can. So the bottom line is, yes, I think you're going to see more evidence of things that might have already been happening for a while by, direct military to military talks and joint exercises. Look, I think that the region is heading towards a Middle East NATO, an Israeli, Arab, maybe American alliance of some sort. It's early yet, and that there's a lot of question marks. But there's been a talk for the last several years of a Middle East NATO, primarily as a bulwark against the Iran threat.
One other thing that it hasn't made the news quite as much as the Abraham Accords is what's happening in Egypt. We know recently Prime Minister Naftali Bennett met with President El-Sisi, but there's some advances El-Sisi's making in terms of religious freedom inside Egypt. Talk about that.
Yeah. Well, I want to say that I think Prime Minister Naftali Bennett is doing an amazing job building out relationships with these Arab leaders. He's really made it a high priority to meet secretly at first with King Abdullah of Jordan, then openly with President El-Sisi in Egypt. And of course, it won't be long before Naftali Bennett heads to become the first prime minister ever to make state visits to the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. This is very encouraging. We're moving in the right direction. Look, I think Egypt overall is doing a great job under President El-Sisi advancing religious freedom. He has rebuilt all the churches that were burned down in Egypt during the Muslim Brotherhood's reign of terror. He has built, of course, the largest church cathedral in the history of the Middle East and gave it to the Christians of Egypt on Christmas Eve a few years ago. You and I were there to cover that. And I think if you talk to Coptic Orthodox leaders in Egypt and Egyptian Protestant Christian leaders, evangelicals, they feel encouraged that the climate is getting better for churches opening, for example, being able to have the freedom to actually open a church or renovate a church or expand a church. But there are deep systemic problems, both in the law and more importantly in the culture, that still make Egyptian Christians feel anxious at times. And so I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done. But I'm a person who is trying to say, if there's progress, let's note it and let's applaud it, encourage it, and then press for more. Others take a very different approach, which is to constantly be saying, it's not enough, it's not enough, it's not enough. It's not enough, but I don't think that it's not my approach to just criticize and attack Sisi or others in the government for not doing enough when you realize, where have we come from? Mm-hmm. We've come from the horrors of the Muslim Brotherhood regime, and we've come a long way in a positive direction, and this should be applauded. And I spent a lot of time in Enemies and Allies on Egypt because they're making so much progress. In many ways, I think Egypt is helping set the standard, especially since they're the largest Arab Muslim country in the world. What they do vis-a-vis Christians really matters. Mm-hmm. And to build the largest church in the history of the Middle East and give it as a gift on Christmas Eve to Christians is not just a signal to Christians, it's a signal to other Muslim countries, including our friends, the Saudis, mm-hmm. who don't have a single church of any kind that is able to operate in the kingdom. And it's something I'm trying to press MBS. It's time. It's time. You've got 1.4 million foreign workers and their families who are Christians in Saudi Arabia, helping build your country. It's time to let them have churches.
Again, 1 year later, here we are in November 2021. You were on the White House lawn there, September 2020. Describe sort of the progress of the Abraham Accords since that time.
It's been amazing, the progress. We're watching business deals to be developed, tourism deals. We're seeing the Jerusalem Post forming a media alliance with an Emirati newspaper and TV company. We're seeing Israeli airlines open up direct routes to Arab countries, UAE, Bahrain, Morocco. We're seeing Moroccan and Emirati and Bahraini airlines flying direct routes into Israel. We had the economic minister for the United Arab Emirates say between now and 2030, he thinks there could be $1 trillion worth of economic growth because of the Abraham Accords. $1 trillion. That may be wildly optimistic, but if you hear that type of language coming out of the mouths of senior officials, it tells you how excited they are. I've sat with them, I've listened to them, and both before the Abraham Accords and now that it's open. And the Arab leaders are very, very excited. Not just what's happening in the last year and a few months, but where this is going. And I describe it in the book as a coming Middle East gold rush. There are venture capitalists on a lot of these planes back and forth. There's a lot of Zoom calls between Israel, venture capitalists, and high-tech people and VCs in the Gulf. And Morocco, too. I just think it feels like the sky is the limit, and that's the positive story. The problem is, at the same time, you not only have the Iran threat, but Iran forming an alliance with Russia and Turkey and North Korea and China. So that's the darkness to the east and the north, and then we have all this light here and to the west. And so, to use a weather analogy, those are two building fronts, and there's always the danger that when those two fronts meet, there's going to be a storm.
Final questions, Joel. Do you see prophetic implications in this, and how can Christians be praying?
I think there are prophetic implications. The first, of course, is just saying we're commanded to pray for peace. God is granting peace. But let's remember what's coming. What Jesus describes are birth pangs. And those are contractions and release. Moments of contraction, pain, and difficulty and stress, and then a release. And as you get closer to the return of Christ, as in the birth pangs analogy, when you get closer to the moment that you're looking forward to, the pain and the contraction gets worse and longer, and the release periods get shorter. We're in a release moment in the Middle East compared to the last 20 years. Terror, war in Iraq, war in Afghanistan, the rise of a caliphate, genocide against Christians, right? Those were serious, horrible contractions. Now we're in this moment where you and I are standing here talking about peace and prosperity. That's good, but when you look at the prophecies to come, we know that other major contractions are coming. The destruction of the entire city of Damascus, never to be rebuilt. That has never happened, but that's coming. The war of Gog and Magog, Russia, Turkey, Iran, Libya, other countries forming an alliance against Israel. That's forming, but it hadn't come to pass yet. There are other major contractions coming. So we always have to keep our eye on the big picture, not to get so excited about the good moments, to not realize that there are storm clouds brewing, but not to get so focused on what Satan is doing that we don't pay attention to what Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit is doing, because it's two stories moving in opposite directions. The good news is we know how the story plays out. Ultimately, Israel will be victorious because of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the Lord Jesus Christ, who will reign from right here, and won't CBN have a good base camp to cover it?
Let me ask one final question. The pullout of the U.S. pullout from Afghanistan, what impact do you see that happening in the region and especially here in Israel?
The Biden pullout, surrender really, of Afghanistan on the eve of 9/11 has been the single most catastrophic moment in the Middle East in recent years. It has emboldened the very radical Islamist enemies of the United States, Israel, and the moderate Arab world. And the Biden surrender in Afghanistan has also been catastrophic for Biden politically back home in the United States. He's just lost Virginia, a state that he won by 10 points. He lost it handily, not just at the governor's level, the lieutenant governor, and I think the House of Delegates. And he almost lost New Jersey, a very blue state. Why? In part because the American people's support for Biden has plummeted, really cratered, and it all began with his surrender in Afghanistan. So that decision was bad geopolitically. It was bad in terms of U.S. and Israeli security, but it's also had a very serious effect in a way that I don't think Biden foresaw. I think he read the polls when he asked the question, do you want us to be done with the war in Afghanistan or go on forever? Well, that's not a hard poll to answer. We want it to be done. And that's the poll numbers he was looking at to make his decision. But that wasn't the only way to ask the question. The other question was, do you want the United States to be humiliated by surrendering to the Taliban on the eve of 9/11 and leaving $86 billion of military equipment behind and leaving Americans behind enemy lines? People would say, no, 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 no. And Biden didn't ask those questions, and yet that's what he's battling today. And the worst part about that, from our perspective as analysts, is not so much the domestic concerns back in the United States. The biggest concern is that Biden's surrender to the Taliban is making every enemy of the United States and Israel say, Biden is weak. And if Biden is willing to surrender in Afghanistan, which he doesn't care about, where else might we test him? What else might we be able to get from him? What other attacks could we launch? And he won't do anything about it. That's what I worry about. That's what we need to be praying about.
Yeah. Well, a lot of things to be praying about and concerned about. Joel Rosenberg, thanks for joining us. Appreciate your new book, Enemies and Allies, and hope to see you soon.
Great to be with you. Thanks, Chris.